I am Geneva Mitchell, 32 years old, and until last month, I was the respected compliance manager at Sutton & Myers law firm. For 6 years, I built my reputation on integrity and attention to detail, making sure our prestigious firm followed every regulation. Then I returned from a 2-week vacation to find someone else in my office. My carefully organized workspace was completely transformed. The final insult, an Instagram post from the CEO's niece, Amber, took the throne. Number new office, number power moves. If you are watching this, drop a comment telling me where you would draw the line if someone took what you earned. Subscribe to see how one email changed everything. The path to my position at Sutton & Myers was not an easy one. After graduating with honors in business administration, with a specialization in corporate compliance from Northwestern University, I spent 3 grueling years obtaining my certified compliance and ethics professional certification while working entry-level compliance jobs. What others saw as tedious regulatory work I viewed as the backbone of ethical business practices. Every regulation existed because someone had previously cut corners, harmed consumers, or betrayed public trust. I found purpose in being the guardian of corporate integrity. Sutton & Myers was not just any law firm. Founded in 1978 by Harold Sutton and James Myers, it had grown from a small practice to one of Chicago's most respected corporate law firms. Their client roster included Fortune 500 companies, international corporations, and influential local businesses. The firm occupied the top 5 floors of a gleaming downtown skyscraper with views of Lake Michigan that reminded everyone of the firm's prestigious position. The decor was all dark wood leather and subtle displays of success. Law Journal features photographs with politicians and awards that conveyed authority without being ostentatious. As compliance manager, my responsibilities included ensuring the firm adhered to all legal and ethical standards in its operations. I reviewed client acceptance procedures, monitored attorney conduct for conflicts of interest, oversaw financial compliance, and ensured proper documentation for everything from billable hours to client trust accounts. I reported directly to the partners, which made my position both powerful and precarious. My signature on compliance documents was the firm's guarantee to regulators that everything was above board. My office reflected my achievement. Located on the 48th floor with the senior staff, it had a small but cherished view of the lake. I had carefully curated the space over my 6 years. On my desk sat a small jade plant my mother had given me on my first day, now thriving, and 3 times its original size. Behind my desk hung my framed certifications and a tasteful print of Justice with her scales, a gift from my mentor Diane. My bookshelf held reference materials organized by subject and frequency of use. A small conference table occupied one corner for meetings that required discretion. Everything had its place, just as every regulation had its purpose. My relationships with coworkers were cordial, but somewhat distant. The nature of my job placed me in the uncomfortable position of sometimes having to tell colleagues they could not proceed with certain actions or needed additional documentation. Associates preparing for trial did not appreciate compliance red tape delaying their work. Partners resented having their judgment questioned by someone younger. Still, most respected that I was simply doing my job. Rebecca from the legal research department occasionally joined me for lunch. Nathan in accounting appreciated my attention to detail. Amanda at reception always had a warm greeting. The leadership team had mixed feelings about my role. Some partners like Eleanor Stevens valued the protection compliance provided against malpractice claims and regulatory penalties. Others, particularly Gregory Hoffman and Martin Wells, saw compliance as a necessary evil that slowed down business and limited creative solutions for clients. My direct supervisor, Jackson Wright, walked a careful line between supporting my work and not alienating the partners who disliked compliance oversight. He was politically savvy, always careful about which battles to fight. Harold Sutton, the CEO and founding partner, was a complicated figure in my professional life. In his late 60s, he was old school, believing in handshake deals and personal relationships over formal processes. He respected my work in theory, but often seemed annoyed by the practical implications. In my day, we practiced law without all these forms, he would say when signing required documents. Still, he understood that modern legal practice required proper compliance, especially with their international clients. He valued my thoroughness, but sometimes dismissed my concerns as excessive caution. The firm operated on a clear hierarchy. At the top sat the named partners, then other equity partners, followed by non-equity partners, senior associates, junior associates, and professional staff. The environment encouraged competition and measured success primarily through billable hours and client acquisition. Office location size and furnishings were visible symbols of status. My office, while not extravagant, signified my important role in the firm's operations. Several key players would become central to the situation that unfolded. Marissa Bennett, the HR director, had been with the firm for 15 years. She was generally fair but conflict avoidant, preferring to smooth over issues rather than address them directly. Trevor Phillips served as chief legal officer responsible for managing the firm's own legal affairs. Cold and calculating, he made decisions based on risk assessment rather than human impact. He viewed people as either assets or liabilities to the firm. Then there was Amber Sutton-Harold's niece. I had met her briefly at the firm's holiday party 6 months earlier. 26 years old, with a recently acquired MBA from a mid-tier business school, she carried herself with the entitlement of someone who had never faced significant obstacles. Her conversation centered on connections rather than competence. I remember her commenting that compliance seems boring when I mentioned my role, before quickly moving on to speak with a senior partner. My personal life reflected my professional dedication. Single and focused on my career, I lived in a comfortable one-bedroom apartment 20 minutes from the office. My evenings were often spent reviewing regulatory updates or preparing compliance training materials. Weekends included visits to my mother, whose arthritis was worsening with age, requiring increasing support. I had few close friends outside work, but maintained a close relationship with my mentor, Diane Carter, a senior compliance officer at another firm who had guided my career development. The day before my vacation, I completed a major quarterly compliance report and prepared detailed notes for any issues that might arise during my absence. I met with Jackson to review ongoing projects, including preparations for an upcoming regulatory audit scheduled for 3 months later. Everything was in order, all systems running smoothly. I had earned this break, my first in 2 years, a 2-week trip to visit my college roommate who had moved to Arizona. "Have a great trip," Geneva Jackson said, as I stopped by his office on my way out. "Everything will be fine here. You have set up all the systems to run perfectly." I remember smiling, appreciating his acknowledgement of my thorough preparation. "Thanks, Jackson. I will see you in 2 weeks. Call if anything urgent comes up, but I do not anticipate any issues." As I boarded my flight the next morning, I felt a rare sense of relaxation. The weight of ensuring the firm's regulatory compliance temporarily lifted from my shoulders. The Arizona sunshine beckoned, and I looked forward to hiking, catching up with my friend, and returning refreshed to tackle the preparations for the upcoming audit. I had no idea that while I soaked up the desert sun, the foundation of my professional life was being systematically dismantled. My return flight landed early on Monday morning. Despite the time difference and travel fatigue, I felt energized. The vacation had been exactly what I needed, days filled with outdoor adventures and evenings of laughter with my old friend. I had even brought back small souvenirs for my closest colleagues, a handmade turquoise paperweight for Jackson, local desert honey for Rebecca, and a cactus-shaped stress ball for Amanda, at reception, who often joked about needing one. The Chicago morning was brisk as my taxi pulled up to the gleaming building that housed Sutton and Myers. I adjusted my blazer, smoothed my hair, and walked through the revolving doors with a confidence built on 6 years of proven competence. The security guard nodded in recognition as I scanned my badge. The first sign that something was wrong came when I reached the reception desk. Amanda, usually warm and chatty, barely met my eyes. "Good morning, Amanda," I said, placing the small gift bag on her desk. "I brought you something from Arizona." "Oh, thanks, Geneva," she replied, her voice unnaturally high. "How was your trip?" She glanced nervously toward the elevator, then back at her computer screen. "It was wonderful. Is everything okay?" "Everything is fine," she said too quickly. "You should probably head upstairs. There have been some changes while you were away." The elevator ride to the 48th floor felt longer than usual. As the doors opened, I spotted Rebecca near the coffee station. She quickly looked away when she saw me becoming suddenly engrossed in stirring her coffee. "Rebecca, is something going on?" I asked, approaching her. She lowered her voice. "You should check in with Jackson as soon as possible. There has been some reorganization." My pace quickened as I headed toward my office. From a distance, I could see that my door, normally closed as I handled confidential materials, was open. As I approached, I heard an unfamiliar female laugh coming from inside. I paused at the threshold, momentarily disoriented. The space that had been my carefully organized office for 6 years was transformed. The walls, previously adorned with my credentials and professional items, now displayed abstract art pieces and framed fashion magazine covers. My solid, practical desk had been replaced by a glass and chrome monstrosity covered with fashion magazines and a large vase of exotic flowers. My reference materials were gone, replaced by decorative objects and a few business books with uncracked spines. And sitting in a white leather chair behind the desk was Amber Sutton, the CEO's niece. "Oh, Geneva," she said, looking up from her phone with a practiced smile. "You are back. No one told me when you were returning." I stood frozen in the doorway. "What is happening? Why are you in my office?" Amber's smile remained fixed, but cooled several degrees. "This is actually my office now. I have been appointed as the new director of operational compliance. Uncle Harold felt we needed fresh perspectives in the department." Director of... That position did not exist. Before I left, I managed to say, my mind racing to process this information. "The firm is evolving," Amber replied with a dismissive wave. "We are streamlining several departments. Do not worry, there is still a place for you here. HR should have all the details." She turned her attention back to her phone, effectively dismissing me. I backed out of the office, my office, feeling as though I had stepped into some alternate reality. I immediately headed to Jackson's office, hoping for an explanation that would make sense of this situation. Jackson looked uncomfortable the moment I appeared in his doorway. He gestured for me to come in and closed the door behind me. "I was going to call you today," he began, not quite meeting my eyes. "There have been some organizational changes while you were away." "Jackson, I just found Amber Sutton sitting in my office claiming to be the director of operational compliance. What is going on?" He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "The decision came from above Geneva. Harold decided to create a new oversight position and appointed Amber. Your role has been adjusted." Adjusted? I was the compliance manager. What adjustment could possibly require taking my office and apparently my position? "You are still in compliance," Jackson said quickly. "Just reporting through a different structure now. You will report to Amber, who reports directly to Harold and the board." The realization hit me like a physical blow. I have been demoted while I was on vacation. Jackson winced. "I fought against the timing, Geneva. I suggested waiting until you returned, but Harold was insistent that Amber start immediately." "And my office. My materials. Your new workspace is being prepared. If you check with Marissa in HR, she can fill you in on the details and get you set up." I left Jackson's office feeling numb. The souvenirs I had brought back remained in my bag, suddenly inappropriate. The meeting with Marissa in HR did nothing to improve the situation. Seated in her overly warm office with its motivational posters, I listened as she explained the organizational restructuring in corporate doublespeak, designed to obscure rather than clarify. "We are optimizing departmental efficiency by creating clear leadership channels," she said, sliding a folder across her desk. "Your new role as compliance specialist allows you to focus on your strengths in regulatory detail, while Amber brings strategic vision to the department." "This is a demotion," I stated flatly. Marissa's smile tightened. "We do not view lateral adjustments as demotions, Geneva. Your compensation package remains the same for now, though your office allocation reflects the new organizational structure." My new office turned out to be a windowless room on the 45th floor, previously used for document storage. The space was half the size of my former office, with fluorescent lighting that hummed incessantly and furniture that had seen better days. Stacked carelessly in the corner were several boxes containing my personal items from my former office. I spent the next hour unpacking, discovering that my jade plant had been overwatered to the point of root rot, my framed certifications had cracked glass, and several reference materials were missing. As I arranged what remained of my professional life in this basement, like space emails began flooding my inbox, reassigning my previous responsibilities, removing me from committee positions, and introducing Amber as the new compliance. Leadership to clients and regulators. During a quick trip to the break room for much-needed coffee, I overheard two associates speaking in hushed tones. "Complete nepotism," one was saying. "She has zero compliance experience." "What happened to Geneva?" "Is she fired?" asked the other. demoted to some back-office position. Supposedly they are transitioning the department, but everyone knows what really happened. I cleared my throat as I entered, and they immediately fell silent, offering awkward smiles before hurriedly leaving with their coffees. Back at my new desk, I opened my laptop and saw a notification for a new Instagram post from the firm's account. Curious. I clicked through to find a professional photograph of Amber in my former office, captioned, "Sutton and Myers welcomes Amber Sutton as our new Director of Operational Compliance number, new leadership number, excellence." Amber had shared this on her personal account with her own caption, "Took the throne number, new office number, power moves." The comments section was filled with congratulations from her social circle, including several partners at the firm. The betrayal felt complete, not just professional but publicly humiliating. I spent the remainder of that first day back reviewing emails sent during my absence, piecing together what had happened. A week after I left, Harold had announced the creation of the new director position. 3 days later, Amber was introduced to the staff. By the end of my first week away, she had moved into my office and begun reassigning my responsibilities to herself and other team members. As the reality of the situation sank in, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Betrayal from the firm I had served, loyally anger at the injustice, confusion about how Amber could possibly handle the complex compliance requirements, and fear for my professional future. Part of me wanted to walk out immediately to tender my resignation and never return to this toxic environment. But another part, the part that had built my career on attention to detail and professional integrity, whispered that something was very wrong beyond the personal slight. Compliance was not a role for someone without training or certification. The firm's legal operations depended on proper regulatory oversight. What was really happening here? As I sat in my new diminished office, fighting back tears of frustration, I made a decision. I would not quit. Not yet. I would understand exactly what was happening, and why. 6 years of building my reputation for integrity deserved at least that much. The next morning I arrived at the office early, determined to gain clarity on my situation. I drafted a formal email to Jackson, requesting a written explanation of my position change, including specific responsibilities, reporting structure, and the reason for the reorganization. The response came back within an hour, vague and non-committal. As discussed, the compliance department is undergoing strategic restructuring to align with firm growth objectives. Your role adjustment reflects shifting priorities rather than performance concerns. Specific duty assignments will be communicated as the transition continues. This corporate non-answer only strengthened my resolve to understand what was really happening. I decided to speak with colleagues who might have insight into the decision-making process. During lunch, I sought out Nathan from accounting, who had always been straightforward with me. "The timing is suspicious," Nathan said quietly as we sat in a cafe 2 blocks from the office. From what I overheard, Amber had been complaining to her uncle about her previous job at Meridian Consulting. Apparently she felt underutilized there. So this was a convenient solution to a family problem, I concluded bitterly. Nathan nodded. I was in a budget meeting when Trevor mentioned creating a new director position. Harold said something about giving his niece a chance to prove herself in a leadership role. No one expected her to completely replace you, though. This information confirmed my suspicions but raised more questions. Why compliance specifically? And why remove me so completely from my established role? I thanked Nathan for his honesty and returned to the office with renewed determination to investigate further. Over the next few days, I discovered that my system access had been significantly restricted. I no longer had administrator privileges for the compliance database I had helped design. My access to certain client files was revoked. Even my ability to view regulatory correspondence was limited. These changes effectively prevented me from performing many aspects of my previous job. I sent detailed emails to both Jackson and Marissa, documenting these access issues and requesting restoration of necessary privileges to fulfill even my reduced responsibilities. The responses were delayed and evasive, citing system updates and access reconfiguration during transition. Meanwhile, I attempted to schedule a meeting with Harold Sutton directly. His assistant informed me that his calendar was full for the next 3 weeks, but she would try to find an opening. Each subsequent inquiry was met with a new excuse. As the days passed, I noticed a growing isolation. Colleagues who had previously sought my advice now directed their questions to Amber. Conversations would stop when I entered the break room. Even Rebecca began making excuses to avoid our usual lunch. The message was clear: my reduced status made me professionally radioactive. The situation triggered deep insecurities I had battled throughout my career. Was I overreacting? Had my work not been as valued as I believed? Perhaps I had misunderstood my importance to the firm all along. These doubts crept in during quiet moments, threatening to overwhelm my normally confident professional identity. To counter these feelings, I began methodically researching company policies regarding position changes. The employee handbook stated that significant role modifications should include formal documentation, performance rationales, and a minimum 2-week transition period. None of these protocols had been followed in my case. I reached out to my mentor Diane Carter, meeting her for dinner after work to explain the situation. "This is not just unprofessional, it is potentially dangerous for the firm," Diane said, after hearing the full story. "Compliance is not a training ground for inexperienced relatives. It carries serious legal implications." Exactly my concern, I agreed. But what can I do? They have effectively sidelined me. "Document everything," Diane advised firmly. "Every email, every access, change every policy violation. Note any compliance issues that arise under the new leadership. Do not volunteer to fix problems unless asked directly. Sometimes people need to see the consequences of their poor decisions." Following Diane's advice, I began keeping meticulous records. Through careful observation and conversations with junior compliance staff still willing to speak with me, I discovered that Amber lacked the basic certifications required for overseeing financial compliance matters. Her MBA provided no specific training in legal regulatory requirements, yet her signature now appeared on compliance documents that carried potential liability. More concerning, I found evidence that my name had been removed from regulatory filings without proper protocol. Certain reports submitted during my vacation still listed me as the responsible compliance officer despite Amber's appointment. This discrepancy created a dangerous gap in accountability. If regulators raised questions, neither Amber nor I would be properly positioned to address them. After 2 weeks of gathering information, I decided to escalate my concerns to Trevor Phillips, the chief legal officer. Though calculating and political, Trevor understood legal risk. Surely he would recognize the dangerous position the firm was creating. "I appreciate your concerns, Geneva," Trevor said during our meeting, his voice measured and cool. "But the transition has been approved at the highest levels. Amber is being mentored by Harold directly, and we have outside counsel available if specialized compliance questions arise." Outside counsel is not the same as internal compliance oversight, I pointed out, and there are already documentation inconsistencies that could cause problems during our upcoming audit. Trevor's expression hardened. "I would be careful about making accusations regarding improper practices. The firm is operating within all necessary guidelines. If you are finding it difficult to adapt to organizational changes, perhaps you should consider whether Sutton & Myers remains the right fit for your career goals." The veiled threat was unmistakable. I was being told to accept the situation or leave. As I left Trevor's office, a disturbing realization formed. If the chief legal officer was dismissing legitimate compliance concerns, the issue went beyond simple nepotism. Something more troubling might be happening. That evening, I reviewed the compliance calendar I had created before my vacation. In less than 2 months, the firm would undergo its scheduled regulatory audit, a comprehensive review of client trust accounts, conflict checks, and regulatory filings. This audit occurred every 3 years and required extensive preparation, which should have already begun. Under normal circumstances, I would have started assembling documentation weeks ago. Had Amber initiated this process? Did she even understand what was required? And if the audit revealed the compliance gaps, I was beginning to identify what would happen to the firm, and to me, as the previous compliance manager. As I sat in my apartment that night, surrounded by notes and policy documents, I recognized that this situation had evolved beyond a personal injustice. The firm's regulatory standing, and potentially its clients' interests, were now at risk. Whatever was happening at Sutton & Myers, I needed to understand the full scope before deciding my next steps. In the weeks that followed, I maintained a careful balance between performing my reduced duties and documenting the growing list of compliance irregularities. While I had been blocked from many systems, junior staff members often came to me with questions that Amber could not answer, providing glimpses into the deteriorating compliance situation. I created a secure digital folder storing evidence of each problematic decision and procedural change. The modifications were concerning documentation requirements, relaxed review periods, shortened approval thresholds raised. Each change by itself might seem minor, but together they systematically dismantled the careful compliance structure I had built over 6 years. One Tuesday morning I arrived early and overheard a conversation between Trevor and Amber in the conference room next to the break area. Not wanting to eavesdrop but hearing my department mentioned, I paused outside the partially open door. "The priority is streamlining," Trevor was saying. "Some of these compliance protocols are excessive. Geneva was too cautious, which slowed down our operations." "I completely agree," Amber replied. "These forms are redundant. Clients hate paperwork, and the associates waste billable hours on documentation. I have already eliminated the secondary review requirement for new client matters." I froze. The secondary review was a critical safeguard against conflicts of interest, a fundamental ethical requirement for law firms. Eliminating it wasn't streamlining, but potentially violating bar association rules. "Just make sure whatever changes you make look consistent if regulators review our process," Trevor cautioned. "Document your rationale for any significant modifications." "Of course," Amber said confidently. "Everything will be fine for the audit. I am creating a more efficient department." I slipped away before they emerged, my heart racing. This confirmed my worst fears. They were deliberately reducing compliance measures while creating paper justifications to satisfy regulators. This went beyond incompetence into potentially willful misconduct. The stress began taking a physical toll. I had trouble sleeping, lost weight, and developed persistent headaches. My mother noticed the change during our weekly dinner. "You look exhausted, sweetheart," she said, her concern evident. "Is this job worth what it is doing to you?" "I do not know anymore, Mom," I admitted. "What they are doing is wrong, but if I leave, it only gets worse. And finding a new position will be difficult if I cannot get a good reference from my current employer." She reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "You have always stood up for what is right, Geneva. That is who you are. Whatever you decide, I know you will do it with integrity." Her support strengthened my resolve to see this through, whatever the outcome. Back at the firm, Amber's behavior became increasingly bold. She began sending company-wide emails announcing compliance innovations that were really just eliminations of necessary safeguards. She conducted meetings with clients where she presented herself as a longtime compliance expert. Her office, my former office, became a showcase for her apparent success, with partners frequently stopping by for casual chats that never would have happened when I occupied the space. Through careful observation and discreet conversations with staff, I made a critical discovery. Amber had authorized changes to client trust account procedures that directly violated state bar regulations. The modified procedures allowed faster access to client funds with reduced documentation, a change that might please impatient partners, but created serious ethical and legal risks. The technical details were significant. Client trust accounts require strict separation and documentation to prevent commingling of funds. The proper procedure required 2-level authorization for any fund transfer supporting documentation and a mandatory waiting period for large withdrawals. Amber's new procedure eliminated the second authorization and shortened the documentation requirements to a simple form. This was not merely a procedural preference, but a violation of regulatory requirements that could potentially lead to disciplinary action against the firm. Even more concerning, the changes had been implemented retroactively, meaning previous transactions were now non-compliant with our stated procedures. I decided to confront Amber directly, hoping that perhaps she simply did not understand the implications of her changes. I requested a meeting, which she finally granted after several delays. I wanted to discuss the recent changes to the client trust account procedures. I began, keeping my tone professional and constructive. "There are some regulatory concerns with the new process that could create problems during the audit." Amber leaned back in her chair, my former chair, with a dismissive expression. "The old procedures were unnecessarily complicated. We are modernizing our approach." "The dual authorization requirement is not optional," I explained. "It is a regulatory mandate from the Bar Association. Eliminating it puts the firm at risk of compliance violations." "I have discussed our process improvements with Uncle Harold and Trevor," she replied coolly. "They support my initiatives to make the department more efficient. Perhaps this is why you were in this role for 6 years without advancement. an inability to evolve beyond rigid thinking. The personal attack was unexpected, but revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of the compliance function. This is not about flexibility versus rigidity. It is about legal requirements versus violations. "I think we are done here," Amber said, turning to her computer screen. "The compliance department is moving in a new direction. You can either adapt or not, but the changes are happening. You are easily replaceable, Geneva. Remember that." The conversation left me shaken but more certain than ever that intervention was necessary. The firm was heading toward a regulatory disaster that would affect everyone from partners to clients. After weeks of attempts, I finally secured a 15-minute meeting with Harold Sutton. I prepared a concise presentation of the most serious compliance issues, focusing on regulatory requirements rather than personal grievances. Harold listened with visible impatience, frequently checking his watch. When I finished outlining the issues with client trust accounts, he sighed heavily. "Geneva, I appreciate your attention to detail, but Amber has brought a fresh perspective to our compliance approach. Sometimes we need to modernize outdated procedures." "Mr. Sutton, with respect, these are not outdated procedures, but current regulatory requirements. The changes create significant legal exposure for the firm." His expression hardened. "Are you suggesting my niece is not qualified for her position?" "I am pointing out specific compliance issues that need immediate attention, regardless of who is in charge," I replied carefully. "Amber comes from a business background that values efficiency and client satisfaction," Harold said dismissively. "Perhaps the compliance department has been too focused on rules and not enough on business needs. Change can be difficult to accept, especially when it affects our established routines." His patronizing tone made it clear that he was not interested in the substance of my concerns. Family loyalty, and perhaps something else, were overriding his usually sound judgment. As I left his office, I checked my email to find a notification about the upcoming regulatory audit, now scheduled for 3 weeks earlier than originally planned. The accelerated timeline would make proper preparation even more difficult, especially with the compliance issues I had identified. Later that day, while retrieving a document from the compliance file room that I still had access to, I discovered a folder containing emails between Trevor and several partners. The folder had been misfiled in the general compliance section rather than in confidential legal correspondence. What I read confirmed my worst suspicions. Trevor was aware of the compliance issues, but had advised Harold that they could manage the regulatory review by presenting carefully selected documentation. More disturbing, they discussed the benefits of having compliance leadership without unnecessary regulatory caution ahead of a major client acquisition that required compliance certification. That evening, searching through public business news, I found an announcement that Sutton & Myers was in talks to acquire Harrington Legal, a smaller firm with lucrative international clients. The acquisition would significantly expand their business, but would require certification of proper compliance structures to handle the international regulatory requirements. The pieces suddenly fit together. The firm needed the acquisition to go through, but did not want compliance obstacles slowing the process. My strict adherence to regulatory requirements would have required additional systems and procedures before certifying readiness for the international clients. By replacing me with Amber, they gained a compliance director who would sign off on whatever they needed without raising difficult questions. The final breaking point came the next morning, when a junior compliance staff member, Luis, came to my office looking troubled. "Geneva, I do not know what to do about this," he said, sliding a document across my desk. "Amber asked me to file this certification, but I noticed something strange about the signature." The document was a quarterly compliance certification requiring the signature of a certified compliance officer. It contained my signature, but I had never seen the document before, let alone signed it. "She said you had pre-signed some forms before your vacation," Luis continued. "But the date on this is from last week." I stared at the forged signature, a nearly perfect replication of my own. They had not only demoted me and undermined the compliance department, they were now falsifying documents with my signature, creating liability that could potentially follow me even if I left the firm. That night, sitting in my apartment, surrounded by the evidence I had collected, I made my decision. This had gone far beyond a personal injustice or office politics. The firm was now engaged in activities that were potentially illegal and certainly unethical. As a compliance professional with a regulatory duty that extended beyond my employment, I could not remain silent. The question was not whether to act, but but how to do so most effectively. The weekend gave me time to plan my approach carefully. This situation required strategy, not just emotional reaction. I spread all my documentation across my dining table, organizing evidence chronologically and by severity of the compliance violations. The pattern was clear and damning: systematic dismantling of required compliance procedures, falsification of credentials, forged signatures, and deliberate concealment from regulators. I called my law school classmate Stephanie Ellis, now a partner at a firm specializing in professional ethics and whistleblower cases. Without naming Sutton and Myers specifically, I outlined the situation and asked for her professional assessment. Based on what you have described, there are multiple serious violations, Stephanie confirmed. The forgery of your signature on official compliance documents is particularly troubling. That creates personal liability for you even though you did not authorize it. What are my options? I asked. There is an ethical obligation to address fraud or misconduct that could harm clients, she explained. The proper sequence would be internal reporting through appropriate channels first. If that fails to resolve the issues, external reporting might become necessary. However, you should be aware of potential repercussions. We discussed whistleblower protections under various regulations. As a compliance officer, I had certain legal protections if I reported violations in good faith, but those protections would not prevent professional retaliation or damage to my reputation in legal circles. After our conversation, I researched the specific regulations being violated by the recent changes at the firm. The client trust account modifications clearly violated state bar requirements. The forged signatures constituted fraud. The international compliance certification would require misrepresentations to multiple regulatory bodies. Each violation carried potential penalties from fines to suspension of licenses. I created a comprehensive documentation package organized into clear categories: procedural violations, documentation, falsification, misrepresentations, to clients and regulatory certification issues. For each category, I included specific evidence, relevant regulatory requirements, and potential consequences. The timeline clearly showed that these changes had been implemented after my removal from the compliance leadership position. With this package prepared, I considered my options carefully. Despite everything, I felt a responsibility to the firm where I had worked for 6 years. Many innocent employees and clients would be affected by a regulatory crisis. The most ethical approach would be to give leadership one final opportunity to address these issues internally before escalating to external authorities. I drafted a detailed email to Harold Sutton, Trevor Phillips, and the firm's board members. The message was professional but direct, outlining the specific compliance violations, the regulatory requirements being breached, and the potential consequences. I made no accusations about motivations, but focused entirely on the factual issues and necessary remedial steps. As a compliance professional with ethical obligations extending beyond my employment relationship, I am obligated to bring these serious matters to your attention, I wrote. I am available to discuss appropriate remedial measures and would prefer to resolve these issues internally if possible. I attached selected documentation demonstrating the most serious violations, particularly the forged signature issue. After reviewing the email multiple times to ensure its tone was constructive rather than accusatory, I sent it on Monday morning. The response came faster than I expected. By noon, I received a reply from Trevor copied to all recipients of my original email. Geneva, we have reviewed your concerns and find them to be without merit and potentially defamatory. The characterization of compliance modifications as violations demonstrates a resistance to necessary modernization. Your insinuations about document handling are particularly concerning and unfounded. We suggest focusing on your current responsibilities rather than undermining departmental leadership with these dramatic accusations. Later that afternoon, an email from Amber arrived in my inbox copied to the entire compliance department. Team, I want to address some confusion that may have arisen from outdated compliance perspectives being circulated. Our department is evolving to better serve client needs through streamlined processes. Anyone uncomfortable with our progressive approach should consider whether their career goals align with our forward-thinking vision. I encourage everyone to move on gracefully from past methodologies and embrace our improved systems. The message was clear: my concerns were being dismissed, and I was being painted as resistant to change rather than a professional identifying legitimate violations. They were choosing to proceed with their plan despite the warnings. That evening, I received an unexpected call from a junior associate in the Mergers and Acquisitions Department, whom I had helped with compliance questions in the past. "Geneva, I probably should not be telling you this, but I thought you should know. The Harrington acquisition is bigger than anyone is saying publicly. The international client base includes several regulatory-sensitive industries that require specific compliance certifications. The deal is scheduled to close in 3 weeks, contingent on compliance approval." This information provided the missing piece. The timeline suddenly made sense. They needed to complete the acquisition before the regulatory audit could identify compliance deficiencies. Once the deal was done, they would deal with any regulatory issues after the fact, likely blaming them on transition difficulties rather than willful non-compliance. I spent that night reviewing the specific regulations governing international client compliance for sensitive industries. The requirements were stringent, including demonstrated history of proper compliance controls, exactly what was being dismantled at Sutton and Myers. For the firm to certify compliance readiness would require misrepresentations to international regulatory bodies. The next morning I made my decision. I had fulfilled my ethical obligation to report internally, and the response had been dismissal and implied threats. The potential harm to clients and the firm itself would only increase if these violations continued. External reporting had become necessary. I identified the appropriate regulatory authorities for each category of violation: the State Bar Association for the client trust account issues, the Financial Regulatory Authority for the compliance certification concerns, and the appropriate Libreble SC.1 international regulatory bodies for the misrepresentations related to the pending acquisition. Rather than submitting separate reports to each entity, I prepared a comprehensive whistleblower filing for the State Bar Association, which had procedures for coordinating with other regulatory bodies when multiple issues were involved. I included all my documentation, the timeline of events, the responses to my internal reporting attempt, and the connection to the pending acquisition. After triple-checking the submission for accuracy and completeness, I paused before hitting send. This action would likely end my career at Sutton and Myers, and might make finding another position in compliance difficult. The firm would almost certainly portray me as a disgruntled employee retaliating for a demotion. Was I prepared for the personal consequences of this decision? I thought about my mother's words, about integrity, about Diane's guidance on professional ethics, and about the clients who would be harmed by fraudulent compliance practices. Ultimately, this was why the compliance function existed, to protect against exactly this type of misconduct. At exactly 9:17 Tuesday morning, I submitted the whistleblower filing with all supporting documentation. The system generated an automated acknowledgement and case number noting that initial review typically took 24 to 48 hours. I had barely returned to my work when my phone buzzed with a meeting request. Trevor Phillips was calling an emergency meeting in the main conference room in 30 minutes, with required attendance for senior leadership, the board, and me. No agenda was specified. As I gathered my notes and steeled myself for confrontation, I wondered how they had learned of the filing so quickly. Then I realized they had not. Something else had happened. The timing was too immediate for the regulatory authorities to have already contacted the firm. When I arrived at the conference room, the tension was palpable. Harold Sutton sat at the head of the table, his face ashen. Trevor stood near the display screen, repeatedly checking his phone. Several board members whispered urgently to each other. Amber was notably absent. The answer came moments later when Trevor's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, his face draining of color. Without a word, he walked to Harold and placed the phone in front of him. Harold read whatever was on the screen, then looked up his eyes, finding me immediately. "Geneva," he said, his voice strained. "It seems we need to discuss some compliance matters with greater urgency than previously understood." The conference room fell silent as Harold placed Trevor's phone on the table. The message displayed was from the State Bar Association's Regulatory Division, an official notice of immediate investigation into compliance practices at Sutton and Myers, triggered by credible evidence of serious violations. The notice referenced client trust account irregularities, certification misrepresentations, and potential fraud in regulatory filings. "Would anyone care to explain this?" Harold asked, his voice unnaturally calm. Trevor cleared his throat. "It appears to be a routine inquiry that has been elevated inappropriately. I am sure we can address it quickly." Routine. Harold's voice rose slightly. "The notice specifically mentions possible suspension of our trust account privileges pending investigation, That would halt all client financial transactions immediately. The board members exchanged alarmed glances. Suspension of trust account privileges would effectively paralyze the firm's operations. There must be some mistake, Trevor insisted. Our compliance practices are sound. All eyes turned to me. I had prepared for this moment, but still felt my heart racing. The notification is not a mistake, I said calmly. It refers to specific compliance violations that have been implemented over the past month, particularly regarding client trust accounts and certification procedures. Harold's expression hardened. And how exactly would the Bar Association become aware of these supposed violations? Before I could respond, the conference room door burst open. Amber stormed in, waving her phone. Uncle Harold, what is happening? I just received an email from the regulatory board requesting all compliance documentation for the past 3 months, with specific reference to procedures I modified. She spotted me, and her expression turned accusatory. What did you do? Did you report us because you were upset about your new position? Harold raised a hand to silence her. Amber, sit down. We need to understand exactly what is happening. He turned to Trevor. What is the potential impact of this investigation? Trevor's professional composure finally cracked. It is serious, Harold. The Bar can suspend our ability to handle client funds during investigation. The acquisition would be delayed at minimum, possibly terminated, if compliance certification is questioned. There could be disciplinary actions against partners depending on what they find. And how long have you known about these compliance issues? Harold demanded. Trevor hesitated, glancing at Amber. We were aware that some of the modified procedures might raise questions during routine audit, but we assessed the risk as manageable. The benefits of streamlining outweighed the technical concerns. Technical concerns, I interjected, unable to remain silent. The dual authorization requirement for client funds is not a technicality. It is a fundamental safeguard against misappropriation. The certification signatures require proper credentials that Amber does not possess. These are substantive violations with serious consequences. The board chair, Eleanor Stevens, spoke for the first time. I would like to understand precisely what changes were made to our compliance procedures and who authorized them. I opened my laptop and connected to the display screen. With your permission, I can walk through the specific issues with documentation. For the next 40 minutes, I methodically presented the evidence I had gathered, the modified client trust account procedures, the certification documents with questionable signatures, the emails discussing managing the regulatory review, and the connection to the Harrington acquisition. I maintained a professional tone throughout, focusing on facts rather than accusations. As I concluded, the room remained silent. The board members looked stunned. Harold stared at the table, his earlier anger replaced by something resembling despair. Amber broke the silence. This is completely unfair. I was bringing necessary improvements to an outdated department. Geneva is just trying to sabotage me because she could not adapt to change. Eleanor turned to her with a steely gaze. Did you authorize changes to client trust account procedures without understanding the regulatory requirements? I streamlined unnecessary bureaucracy, Amber insisted. Did you sign Geneva's name to certification documents she never reviewed? Eleanor continued. Amber faltered. I was told she had pre-approved those certifications. By whom? Eleanor pressed. All eyes turned to Trevor, who shifted uncomfortably. There was a misunderstanding about the documentation requirements. I advised Amber that certain compliance formalities could be managed more efficiently during the transition period. Managed more efficiently, Harold repeated incredulously. You advised my niece to forge signatures on regulatory documents. Not explicitly, Trevor defended weakly. I suggested that continuity and compliance documentation was important during leadership transition. The implementation may have been overzealous. Overzealous, Harold's voice rose again. You have placed this entire firm at risk. The Harrington acquisition represents the future of Sutton and Myers. If it falls through because of compliance fraud, the damage will be catastrophic. A knock at the door interrupted the conversation. Jackson entered looking grave. I apologize for the interruption, but we have just received additional notices. The Financial Regulatory Authority has placed a hold on our compliance certifications pending investigation, and the International Regulatory Commission has requested immediate documentation regarding our compliance structures for international clients. The full weight of the situation descended on the room. This was no longer a single inquiry, but a coordinated regulatory response across multiple authorities. The firm was facing a comprehensive investigation that would scrutinize every aspect of its compliance practices. Harold turned to me, his expression a mixture of anger and desperation. "What happens now, Geneva? Is there any way to address this before it destroys the firm?" "The regulatory authorities will conduct their investigation," I explained. "The immediate concern is the suspension of trust account privileges, which would prevent the firm from processing client funds. They will review our documentation, interview relevant personnel, and determine appropriate remedial measures and potential penalties." "And the acquisition?" Eleanor asked. "It will almost certainly be delayed pending resolution of the compliance issues," I acknowledged. "International regulatory bodies are particularly strict about compliance history for sensitive industry clients." The board entered into emergency session, asking me to remain available for consultation. They voted to place Trevor on administrative leave pending investigation and to remove Amber from any compliance oversight immediately. The most pressing decision involved how to address the regulatory inquiries. "We need to be completely transparent," Eleanor insisted. "Further attempts to conceal or minimize these issues will only compound the damage." Harold nodded reluctantly, finally recognizing the severity of the situation. He turned to me once more. "Geneva, you identified these problems. Do you have recommendations for how we should proceed?" "The firm needs to demonstrate good faith efforts to correct the violations immediately," I advised. "Restore the proper compliance procedures, conduct internal audit of all affected accounts and certifications, self-report any additional issues discovered, and implement enhanced oversight to prevent recurrence." "And who should lead this effort?" Harold asked, though the answer was already evident in his tone. The board voted unanimously to reinstate me as compliance manager with expanded authority and direct reporting to the board. My first tasks would include preparing comprehensive responses to the regulatory inquiries and implementing immediate corrective actions for the most serious violations. As the emergency meeting concluded, Amber remained defiant. "This is ridiculous. I was bringing necessary changes to an outdated department. You are all overreacting to minor procedural adjustments." Eleanor fixed her with a stern look. "Amber, your actions have placed this firm in serious jeopardy. I suggest you speak with legal counsel about your personal liability in this matter." After the board members departed, Harold asked me to remain. For several moments he sat in silence, looking suddenly older than his 68 years. "I owe you an apology, Geneva," he finally said. "I allowed personal considerations to override professional judgment. The consequences could have been far worse without your intervention." "The firm can recover from this," I assured him. "But it will require commitment to proper compliance practices going forward." He nodded wearily. "I created this situation by placing Amber in a position she was not qualified for. I was trying to help her career, but I have done her no favors." As we left the conference room, we encountered Amber being escorted from the building by security, her personal items in a box, an ironic mirror of my own experience weeks earlier. Unlike my quiet acceptance, she was arguing loudly about family loyalty and unfair treatment. Watching her departure, I felt no satisfaction, only a somber recognition of how quickly poor decisions can cascade into crisis. This had never been about personal vindication, but about upholding the professional standards that protected the firm, its clients, and ultimately the legal system itself. 3 months after the regulatory notices first appeared, I sat in my restored office, now larger, and with an expanded view of Lake Michigan. The space reflected my new position as Chief Compliance Officer, with direct reporting to the Board of Directors. My jade plant, replaced after its unfortunate demise, was thriving once again on my desk, alongside framed certifications and reference materials meticulously organized on new bookshelves. The intervening months had been intensely challenging. The initial regulatory response had been swift and severe, with client trust account privileges suspended for 2 weeks, while emergency procedures were implemented. The Harrington acquisition had been delayed, but not canceled, contingent on successful completion of a comprehensive compliance overhaul. My first priority had been building a proper compliance department with adequate resources and authority. I had hired 2 additional certified compliance specialists, implemented enhanced documentation systems, and established direct reporting lines to ensure independence from management pressure. The board had approved a substantial budget increase for compliance technology and training. The remediation process required painstaking review of every client account certification and regulatory filing affected by the improper changes. Each issue had to be documented, corrected, and reported to the appropriate authorities with explanation and evidence of proper remediation. Nights and weekends disappeared into the methodical work of rebuilding the firm's compliance infrastructure and reputation. The professional environment at Sutton & Myers had transformed remarkably. Colleagues who had previously avoided me now sought my guidance and approval. Partners who had dismissed compliance as bureaucratic overhead now recognized its essential role in protecting the firm's operations. My recommendations carried weight that would have been unimaginable before the crisis. The personal and professional consequences for those involved had been significant. Amber had eventually found employment at a much smaller firm, in an entry-level position. Her aspirations for executive leadership, tempered by the reality of necessary experience and qualification. Trevor had resigned rather than face termination, his professional reputation permanently damaged by the compliance scandal. Several legal publications had covered the story as a cautionary tale of nepotism and regulatory failure. Harold had emerged, humbled but ultimately respected for his handling of the crisis. His public acknowledgement of the mistakes and personal responsibility for the compliance failures had helped preserve client relationships during the turbulent period. Our working relationship had evolved into one of mutual respect with Harold, frequently seeking my input on matters extending beyond compliance. The healing process had been complicated for me personally. The vindication of my professional concerns had come at tremendous cost to the firm and colleagues I had worked with for years. Rebuilding trust with the team required patience and consistent demonstration of commitment to both regulatory requirements and operational efficiency. I had seriously considered leaving once the immediate crisis was resolved. Diane and other mentors had suggested that my enhanced resume would open doors at more prestigious firms without the complicated history. The betrayal had cut deep, and part of me wanted the clean break of a fresh start elsewhere. Ultimately, I had made the difficult decision to stay. The firm had invested in rebuilding its compliance function properly. The board had demonstrated commitment to ethical practices, and I had the opportunity to implement systems that would prevent similar issues in the future. Sometimes rebuilding was more valuable than walking away. The personal growth from this experience had been transformative. I had learned to trust my professional judgment, even when questioned by authority figures. The importance of documentation and methodical evidence gathering had been reinforced dramatically. Most significantly, I had discovered the courage to stand alone when principles required it despite personal and professional risks. My approach to work-life balance had changed as well. The crisis had illuminated the dangers of defining myself exclusively through professional achievement. I had started setting boundaries around work hours, reconnected with friends outside the legal world, and even begun dating again, something that had taken a back seat during my career-building years. 6 months after the initial crisis, we received the official notice that the regulatory audit had been successfully completed. The auditors specifically commended the rebuilt compliance systems and cited them as models for other firms. The Harrington acquisition had closed the previous week, bringing the anticipated international clients under our now properly certified compliance umbrella. As I finished reviewing the latest quarterly compliance reports, Rachel, a newly hired compliance analyst I was mentoring, knocked on my open door. "I have a question about the international client acceptance procedure," she said. "The documentation requirements seem extensive compared to domestic clients." "They are," I confirmed, "and for good reason. International regulations vary significantly by jurisdiction. The additional documentation ensures we meet all applicable requirements regardless of where the client operates. Some of the partners have asked if we could streamline the process," she admitted hesitantly. I smiled, recognizing the familiar tension between operational efficiency and proper compliance. "Bring them to my next training session. I will explain how these requirements protect both the clients and the firm." Compliance is not about creating obstacles, but about ensuring sustainability and trust. As Rachel left, I reflected on the deeper lessons of the past year. The experience had clarified the distinction between justice and revenge. I had not acted to punish those who wronged me, but to protect the integrity of the compliance function and the firm itself. The outcome had not been about winning a personal battle, but about upholding professional standards essential to the legal system. The fundamental lesson was perhaps most simply stated: integrity cannot be compromised for convenience or politics. In compliance roles, we serve as guardians of ethical practice, sometimes making us unpopular, but always making us necessary. The systems and rules exist not as bureaucratic exercises but as essential safeguards against the very human tendencies toward shortcuts and self-interest. Building proper systems takes more effort than destroying them, but the value created extends far beyond any individual career or company. As compliance professionals, we protect not just regulatory requirements, but the trust that allows organizations and markets to function properly. That purpose transcends personal advancement or vindication. What started as a personal injustice, an office stolen and a position undermined, had revealed systemic weaknesses that needed addressing. By focusing on the principles rather than the personalities, I had helped create something stronger than what existed before. Sometimes the path to justice requires losing something valuable to protect something invaluable. Have you ever stood up for what was right, even when it was difficult? How did you balance the need for justice with the temptation for revenge? Drop a comment sharing your experience with workplace ethics or unfair treatment. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more real-life professional journeys. Share with anyone navigating difficult workplace situations. Sometimes knowing others have faced similar challenges can provide the courage needed to make principled choices. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that your integrity remains when titles and offices change.